The US is absolutely important to Australia. Just look at from a defence point of view, the benefits we get. Training, education, access to technology, access to equipment, doctrine, a whole range of things. If we didn't have that, we would be immeasurably less powerful. I talked about the common hopes and aspirations. We think in a similar ways, and as you know, I taught in the United States at their staff college for 3 years. So I think I understand them, I've worked closely with them, and I do think we'll almost always be with them. But I do want that independent ability to make assessments and be able to act in our own interests. And the example at the moment is that the United States is conducting freedom of navigation missions through the South China Sea. Australia hasn't, and I think that's a good thing. There's some interesting things happening around what President Obama some years ago introduced as the pivot or the rebalance to Asia. And what we saw out of that was that an agreement with the United States Marine Corps that they would come here and there'd be a training establishment for them. They'd be in Darwin. And I'm hesitating saying bases because the mantra is places, not bases. They're not based here, they come here to train. And I think that's a good thing. It wasn't so well received in, I think it was 2011 when they first came here. And Marty Natalegawa, who was the Indonesian foreign minister, got pretty upset. And so it was put in more in the context of humanitarian and disaster relief operations, and I think that's a good context to put it. But now we've moved forward and people are a little bit more conscious of China, what's happened in the South China Sea. Indeed, just a few weeks ago now, we saw Jim Mattis, the US Secretary of Defence, come out with a new national defence strategy where he talked about China and Russia as great powers. He talked about them as revisionist powers, and again we saw that formula of international rules-based order. Our side not wanting to change it, but China and Russia and Brazil and some of the emerging powers looking to change it formally in the United Nations. So what we're seeing is, I think, shifting alliances. We've seen Japan change its constitution and the way it reacts with its constitution. Japan with a national debate. We're seeing Japan, India, the United States and Australia start to think more about military and strategic issues and geopolitical issues. And so that's changing all of those things. And two other things I think are important. The Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment in the United States put out a paper a while ago that talked about Australia being in a geographic sweet spot. And if you think, we're now talking about the Indo-Pacific, and Julie Bishop has got that in her DFAT white paper. So I think we need to just recalibrate a little bit. It's not all about China and the South China Sea. It's not all about the Middle East, but I think we'd have to be now more conscious of what's happening in the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, and that's what is the Indian Ocean and the littoral countries and the countries in the Indian Ocean, because there's an enormous amount of trade comes through. We saw the Quadrilateral first come into play around about Kevin Rudd's time, and people then said, well, this is more about containment of China than anything else. We've seen it start to come back, and part of it is because Japan's new look at its role, its security role, which is a concern about North Korea, but also a concern about some of the islands that are in dispute with China. I'm not so sure about the Quadrilateral. If you're going to have an alliance, or you're going to have the ability to work together, you do need to have lots of things in common. You do need to be able to say, well, this is what we all believe, these are our values and these are our interests. I think that discussion hasn't yet been had at the diplomatic level. In some ways, I see the Quadrilateral as a bit of an impulsive reaction against China. That is, hell, look at what they're doing. Perhaps if we all get together, we can counterbalance China. I'm not sure it's been thought through. I think what we need to be doing with China is much more cooperation, collaboration, and less of what I can see at the moment is containment, because China's important to us. It's important to us economically, but I think it's also got a very firm role to play. It's a good player, anti-piracy, plays in the United Nations, and if if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, some of the work that they're doing, $55 billion to build a transport corridor through Pakistan. This will change the nature of many of the countries that are out there. And I think we need to be thinking, well, what do we do in response to that? How can we be part of it, rather than how do we say, well, no, we don't like that, they shouldn't be doing it. So we've got to think really carefully about this. I'm now engaged with some ex-military types here in Australia, but also in Indonesia, that we've got the ability to talk to each other. We're doing this at a sort of semi-official level, probably semi-official level. But we're trying to imagine what the relationship between Australia and Indonesia will be in the future. I hope it will be a strong one. Indonesia is close, it's growing. It's in our region. I spent a lot of my career in the army with people around me imagining Indonesia as a threat. Well, I don't think they are. We need to get closer to Indonesia for economic reasons. A growing community, a growing economy. We can provide clean green to Indonesia. Militarily, I think we can work with the Indonesians. They're a vital part of the front row against terrorism and the radical Islamists, and I commend Indonesia for the resolve that they're showing there. So I'd like to see us recognise that Indonesia is very much a part of our future, and perhaps in the long term, if things don't go right with China, there's a bit of a hedge there that we could be thinking, well, how do we work with Indonesia to bolster the way that we work in the region? And another point on Indonesia, I wish they'd front up and be leaders in ASEAN. ASEAN suffers, and I think is largely ineffective because there's no effective leadership. It's the Asian way, I know, but I think we'd be much better off if Indonesia stepped forward and showed some real leadership in ASEAN. As I think my way back through that career outline where Australia had been in Asia, after Vietnam we came back and said we won't do that again. Then we found ourselves embroiled in some United Nations things, and global citizen, it's a good thing to do. And we found ourselves in the Middle East. I just wondered about the geopolitics and the geostrategic issues facing Australia. As I used to fly off to the Middle East quite frequently when I was Chief of Army, I was figuratively flying over Indonesia. I was flying over Singapore and Thailand and Malaysia and other parts of Asia, and I kept thinking, why aren't I down there? This is close to us, and geography is still important. Why aren't I down there? And now we're seeing this focus on the Indo-Pacific. And I tie into that as I travelled around Australia as the chief. I saw three different attitudes and outlooks to defence. And you think, Australia's a big place. On the east coast, it was Pacific, it was looking to America. Up in the north, it was more directly into Asia, a better focus on Indonesia. And in Western Australia, it was because it faces the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean states, it was looking that way. So I've tried to reconcile those three things, and it's a difficult thing to do, but it's something I think we have to be conscious of. Firstly, because if you think of the choke points and the lines of communications and the sea lines of communications, if you're going to go into the South China Sea, guess what? You come through the Indonesian archipelago, whether it's the Umbai Salat, the Sunda Strait, whether it's the Straits of Malacca, and that is close to Australia. We see that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at the mouth of the Straits of Malacca are owned by the Indians. And so there's all sorts of things to be done around there. And how do we work with that? How do we comprehend that Australia not only has global responsibilities and global obligations, but we also have obligations to our region. And in some ways, I think we should be perhaps paying more attention to what's happening here in and around Australia. Certainly we need to be looking at the Pacific Island states. I think we have a duty to look after them. We've seen in the Defence White Paper and also in the Foreign Policy White Paper a new focus on Papua New Guinea and East Timor. That's fine. But how do we start to comprehend what's happening off Western Australia? The greater growth and role of India, the fact that these sea lines of communications are bringing all of us our oil, it all comes through the Indian Ocean. What's happening with defence and the economy in Western Australia? We've got about half the Navy over there, but there's a very small army presence. I know many Western Australians who do have a different view of defence. They wonder about the security and protection of the natural resources up across near Broome and the Kimberley and the Pilbara and those sorts of areas. So I think there's a discussion to be had here in Australia. How do we meet all of these obligations with, frankly, what is a very small defence force, and we need to look at what our priorities are. When we think about the Indian Ocean, we need to think about Western Australia. It faces the Indian Ocean. I think we've made very good strategic choices around the Navy in that they're based over in Fremantle and they do a terrific job. But I don't think we've really comprehended the role of the Army in Western Australia. It's a small force, it's a very capable force, but it's a huge part of Australia. It's got some of the most precious natural resources. They're making us enormous amounts of money, and every Western Australia reminds you of the fact that that's where a lot of the exporting comes from. So are we protecting them well enough? Are we conscious of what the threat is? But also Australia needs to consider, well, how do we support people in our region, our allies and friends? How do we make sure that they can look after themselves in the first order? I think we've done that pretty well when we helped the Pacific Islands with their fishery and their sovereignty through the patrol boat program over there. Why don't we have something similar into the Indian Ocean? Why don't we look at a range of conferences and stronger meetings, what we call military diplomacy, if you like? Why don't we look at that? And I think it's time for a bit more of a focus on the West. Of course, we could take advantage of one of the primary advantages of the West. It's big. There's lots of stuff over there. It could be used for training areas. And these days, when we're looking at the changing nature of war and the introduction of new technologies, the largeness and the emptiness of Western Australia could be good for missile support, missile testing, could be testing for electronic warfare, testing for aircraft. So I think we need to look at that one as well. White papers are interesting, aren't they? They're a sort of a declaration for the public, and they don't contain everything in them. You're not going to give away your secrets, you're not going to give away your real intent. But they do, I think, provide that broad policy direction, but most importantly they provide the budget. And the 2009 white paper had a pretty good direction. 12 submarines, oh yeah, okay, wasn't sure about the strategic basis for that. But within a week and a half of the white paper coming down, the budget was pulled. So let's judge a white paper in terms of its policy, but also in terms of its budget. We also need to recognise that white papers are a statement of what we think is going to happen into the future. And as I explained at the start, we thought that the Australian Army was going to defend Australia. We didn't need an expeditionary capability. Well, we did. We weren't ready for it. Timor was a real test. We made some changes after Timor. We made some changes after Afghanistan and Iraq. But what's going to happen next? What will be the nature of the threat? Land, sea, air, okay, domains of warfare are fine. But we've introduced since then space as a new domain of warfare. And we've also just introduced recently cyber as a new domain of warfare. We talked about, through the revolution in military affairs, network-centric operations. That is, we don't have to carpet bomb the railways of Berlin to win the war. Why don't we just take out the switching stations? And I think that's where cyber is taking us. One of the companies I work with at the moment is dealing with space and detection of space junk, so space surveillance. The war in space is on now. The reconnaissance battles are being carried out. The patrols are in place. And the same thing is happening with cyber. So we need to recognise that, but also in a social sense. And one of the authors I really like to read is a bloke called Rupert Smith, retired British Army general. And he starts his book called The Utility of Force with the sentence that says, "War exists no more." And it really makes you think. And he's saying that industrial scale war in the old Napoleonic and First World War sense doesn't exist. What he's talking about now is war among the population. And this is what we're seeing. Look at the refugees around the world. Look at the urban landscape that's left over in Syria. This is war among the population. Other people talk about it being about the mind space rather than the battle space. How do we convince people that they need to be part of a philosophy, that they need to be part of an ideology? And so we really do need to recognise what Rupert Smith says, the utility of force. Is this the right army, the right defence force to fight the battles of the future? And I think the question is out, and the answer is a long way off.